Welcome into the Husker247 Podcast. I'm Mike Schaefer, joined by Michael Bruntz, Brian Christopherson. The national championship is over, but Georgia has not stopped scoring yet. I've been informed we're not going to talk about that game today because there's really not much to discuss. Georgia won it in the first 2 minutes, and, the rest of us moved on with our lives. However, that wasn't the only news from last night. Nebraska added to its wide receiver core with Virginia's fourth leading all-time receiver in terms of yardage, I believe, in Billy Kemp, the fourth, a wide receiver from Virginia, committed to Nebraska, is here over the weekend. What kind of get is this for Nebraska? If Ben Scott was huge for the offensive line and Elijah Judy is interesting for the defensive line, where on that sort of made-up scale over the last 12 seconds, where does Billy Kemp fall for you, Brian Christopherson, when looking at Nebraska's needs at wide receiver?
It seems like a pretty good get. I think he was fourth in Virginia in receptions because he had 74 of them in 2021. He had 74 receptions, no fewer than 3 in a single game. So he was a very high volume guy. He averaged 6.7 receptions during 2020. So the thing that jumps out about him is he knows how to get the football in his hands, and I think he ended up with 1,700 career yards at Virginia. The other interesting part of him is he was a punt returner for his entire career there. So could be a guy who checks a couple boxes, and we like checking boxes on the Husker247 podcast. So makes a lot of sense. I don't think you're going to see, because Matt Rule said it on early signing day. He said we're not going to usually, probably big picture wise, get these senior guys who come in for just a season from the portal. If we get guys from the portal, most times they're going to be 2 or 3 year guys at least. But I think in the case of Kemp and also Joshua Fleeks out of Baylor, I get it because you're at a position group that needs it right now. You need sort of the bridge into the future. And it's a good way to maybe set the foundation with a guy who has a lot of college experience. And there was Virginia fans responding on my timeline last night after the commitment, and they really respected like how tough he was and just, kind of what he was made of there. So I think he's just going to be a solid, not just a clubhouse guy, but a guy who knows how to, catch 3 or 4 passes a game and can help you in that way.
Yeah, his career at Virginia is really interesting. His sophomore, junior years were big in terms of production, and then I think injuries and just sort of Virginia really struggled in 2022, and then obviously their season had a horrific end with everything that happened there. But I think with Billy Kemp, it's hard to know exactly what you're going to get, Bruntz. But what seemed like fair expectations for you with the latest transfer portal wide receiver Nebraska has added? I mean, they've done this now 4 out of the last 5 years, I believe, because you had kind of Inoa in 2019. I don't believe they added anyone in 2020 that was a transfer portal guy. 2021, you had Samori Toure. 2022, Trey Palmer. 2023, Billy Kemp. Now, Toure and Palmer were fantastic. Kind of Inoa was sort of depth for Nebraska. They did have a really nice touchdown catch that allowed you to hit on an oddly specific prediction. We all remember that. But what sort of expectations are you conjuring up in your brain here on January 10th when thinking about Billy Kemp and thinking about Nebraska's wide receiver situation too?
Yeah, I was thinking back to what Marcus Satterfield said at the end of last week that, they're looking for different kinds of wide receivers, different body types, and kind of thinking what Nebraska has on its roster right now in terms of wide receiver. They don't have that kind of like smallish slot type wide receiver on their roster. And I think that's what his role is going to be, is kind of that more of a chain mover. I don't think he's going to necessarily be a huge play guy like a Trey Palmer was. Maybe to a lesser degree what Samori Toure was. I mean, they played him in the slot some, but I think he's going to bring experience. He's been productive when he's been able to stay healthy. Your point about Virginia just being a kind of a mess on offense last year, I think is a piece of it, along with the injuries as to why his production dipped. But, I don't think he's going to come in and necessarily be the number one, absolute huge target that Palmer was, but he can bring you, a number of things in an offense that are really important, and kind of being maybe that safety blanket over the middle, or finding holes in zones and things like that. So, Brian mentioned too the punt return aspect of it, because you lost Trey Palmer, who was kind of the we're going to catch it and return it guy. You lost Oliver Martin, who's the we're just going to catch it and get the ball back guy. So that competition is going to be wide open, next season. So that's another piece of it that I think is pretty important, is at least the guy that's, had to catch collegiate punts with hands in his face and guys, barking on him and stuff like that. So I think it's a good get. And, again, I think Nebraska's done a good job with these transfer portal targets, and they're batting a really high percentage of having a very specific plan for these guys and being able to close quickly. I mean, that's really the name of the game in transfer portal recruiting is, can you communicate your message easily? Do you have a plan for guys that are going to a new place? And, can you kind of close the deal? And I think they've done a good job of that so far.
BC, is there a receiver right now, you can include Billy Kemp now since he's going to be part of Nebraska going forward, where you feel 100% confident that barring injury, they have the ability to have 50 catches in a season?
Not 100% confident, but closest to that would be Marcus Washington if he's part of things, because I really thought he showed signs that he could be that type of guy if Palmer weren't in the equation. Like, obviously Palmer was going to take away a big piece of the pie. But it felt like Marcus was starting to make some bigger catches in Big Ten play. Like, even at Michigan, as bad as that game was offensively, he was like the one guy who showed up and made like 3 or 4 plays. And so he showed that he could, against, elite competition, I think, be that sort of player. So your question, though, is sort of it makes a statement in itself, because I don't think there's just like an obvious, like, Billy Kemp might be the answer, because if you actually want to look at resume, Billy Kemp's done it at Virginia. And it seems like a guy you could just plug in, and he's been around the game long enough. He'll probably figure it out pretty quickly. And I could see a guy like that having 55 catches, in one season, something like that. So Kemp might be my prediction, but other than him, it would be Marcus Washington, I think, next up.
Bruntz, amongst the young guys at the wide receiver position, who kind of has your interest? Janiron Bonner? Is it Victor Jones Jr.? Is it Jaden Doss? Someone coming in like that. Is there anybody that you think, freshman, redshirt freshman or younger, so freshman, incoming freshman, that you think could be, a guy that contributes meaningfully in 2023?
Yeah, it's a tough one, because of guys that were on the roster last year, Bonner's probably the most interesting. I mean, he was the guy that, at least in fall camp and maybe early in the season during non-conference play, we were hearing, okay, this guy's got a shot. He's a physical wide receiver. He's a bigger body, which I think always helps to get guys on the field a little bit earlier if they're able to stand up physically to things. I would probably go there. I mean, beyond him, guys that were on the roster last year, I don't know that there's anybody that I would bet on being even in the 2 deep, just based on, what we've seen and heard to this point. Of the rest of the guys, I mean, Malachi Coleman's got to be the answer, right? I mean, he's 6'3", he's higher 6'3", 190 pounds. I was curious to kind of hear and see how he stood up to better talent at the All-American Bowl and in those practices. And from what, our folks down there were saying. I mean, I think he held up pretty favorably. And, he didn't get a chance to really show that in the game because woof, but the quarterback play not so good.
Bigger
But
mismatch, TCU, Georgia, or East versus West?
I was thinking that in the first half. I was like, man, I think I saw this game already.
Yeah.
But
Where are all the commitments every 5 minutes? These declarations.
yeah, it might have kept my interest a little bit more in that Georgia TCU game if they had some commitments. But no, I mean, Coleman, if he can come in and run good routes and be more of a polished wide receiver, I think he's got a chance just based on build. And I mean, you've got a 6'3", 390-pound guy that can go 4.3. That's a good place to start with. So I think I'd go him out of that whole pool of candidates that might have a shot at doing something.
Okay. Jumping over to the offensive line, where Nebraska has two guys that were in over the weekend in Micah Mazuka. I will never understand how and why it's pronounced that way, but Micah Mazuka and Walter Rouse both visited Nebraska. Both starters, Mazzccua with Baylor, Rouse, a multi-year starter at Stanford. We've got a Philadelphia connection with Mazzccua. I don't know, BC, you talked with Rouse. Is there a natural connection to Nebraska? Is there something there that made Nebraska like a school that he wanted to visit because of relationships prior? Or did they just do a nice job of immediately touching base and building that right away?
I don't know if he had a deep connection, honestly, beyond just recently, but I think he just the way he laid it out was, it's Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma. I think he just saw programs where he liked the possibilities with the coaching from how he analyzed it from a distance and the history of the programs. And, academics is going to be a big part of it for him too. I think, he's going to end up getting his degree. That's the plan at Stanford. He said it's a little complicated, but he's a biomechanical engineering major. And also said he used the phrase during the interview that he had no qualms with his visit to Nebraska. And I thought, like, I like the word qualms, first of all, but also it's not what you hear in your every standard recruiting interview, is it? So he was a really interesting guy to talk to. He was a William Campbell finalist, like one of the 15 guys for scholar football athlete. So he's that type of guy. And man, he would fit right in. The interesting thing about that conversation was he said, this is him talking, of course, but he said that the coaches at Nebraska spoke of left tackle as being his spot. Now, that's not a stunner because that's sort of what he's been. But obviously, it would move the chairs around a little bit for Nebraska with Prohaska and stuff like that if this all ends up happening. We'll see how it goes. I think we're going to know in the next 24 hours or so. It did seem like he was really tossing and turning about it. He said he had trouble sleeping Sunday night because he kept going back and forth trying to visualize where he was at, which one would he fit the best between those three programs. Maybe it's worth something that he did a nice long interview with a Nebraska site. You kind of wonder because sometimes when guys aren't interested at this point, they wouldn't do that. So that's, I think, the hope for Husker fans is it definitely seems like why would you take the time and do that if Nebraska were sort of third on your list automatically as of Monday night? I don't think you would.
Bruntz, when you think of Micah Mazuka, does Nebraska feel like the leader here, given the Baylor connection, given the Philadelphia connection? He certainly seems like he would be a really big win for Nebraska in terms of recruiting a multi-year player out of the portal. And I'm just kind of curious what your feel is for Micah Mazuka right here on Tuesday morning.
Yeah, I think the connections matter in this situation. The Philadelphia connections are strong on this staff. Obviously, the Baylor connections there too. And kind of talking to people in our network, it's been a very quiet recruitment. I don't think people have a very good read on at least as of Tuesday morning, kind of where this one's headed. So I don't know. I mean, I tend to kind of gravitate towards connections in that this type of a situation. I think guys are looking for something a little bit more different this time around. His brother popped up in the Nebraska student directory over the weekend, which I thought was potentially notable.
That damn student directory.
Yeah.
It's caused way more issues than it's ever solved. I'll point that out right now.
Yeah. I mean, you could have a Darnay Holmes situation where he's in 4 different student directories, but I mean, that's notable given that his brother's in the transfer portal is kind of more of a walk-on type kid. So yeah, and there's need. I mean, I even though Nebraska has, I think a decent picture at interior offensive line, I think if you add a guy that's got that kind of experience, I think he could be pretty darn competitive in a position battle. So, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball pick in yet, but I would kind of lean Nebraska at this point as we sit here on Tuesday morning.
Would we can throw Billy Kemp in this too. Would the addition of Rouse or Mazzccua move to number 1 on your transfer portal additions list if you were to rank it out?
Oh, Rouse would be number 1, I think.
Above everything?
Yeah, because I just think, like Brian was saying, with kind of how that would rearrange the chairs. I mean, what it essentially does is it absolutely guarantees, I think, in my mind, that you're getting Corcoran at a guard spot. And that's huge. I mean, it gives you more options at tackle, which is it's something I think they need. I think they need a little bit more competition there. And it's a guy he's a 4-year starter at Power 5 level. Like, that's significant. So, as much as Nebraska needs wide receiver production and Kemp's commitment was a big one. I mean, Rouse.
I'm talking everybody they signed. I'm talking Ben Scott, right. Jeff Sims, Corey Collier, Elijah Judy, Chief Borders.
No,
Marco Ortiz.
Scott would be just a little bit ahead.
I think Ben Scott's still the single biggest addition.
Rouse
even if they
right
get these
him.
Other guys. Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't phrase that correctly.
No, you're fine.
BT, are you in a similar mindset? Rouse would be huge. Yeah, I think you could make a good argument Rouse could be one, but Scott, I would probably put Scott as the biggest one, just because I feel like center is such a challenging spot. You got to manage so much, not just physically, but with the mental aspect of it. And you're the command center of the O-line. So I'd put that at the top. But, even if they only get one out of the two, I think they could get both. But even if they get one out of the two, if it's just Mazzccua or something, I mean, we're talking about this O-line a lot differently with Scott and Mazzccua. And then if you throw Scott on top of that, I mean, that's probably three new starters. They got to go out and win it, but those guys aren't coming. I mean, we're talking about players here. It's not that they just have like 500 snaps under their belt. What it was Scott's number, Bruntz and I were texting it back and forth for a story. It was like he's had 1,700 snaps, maybe more than that. I might be shortchanging him. One of them's had like 2,000 snaps.
Rouse was over 2,000.
Yeah. I mean, these guys have been around the block. And if you look, I know the PFF grades, people wave at them. I do actually myself. Yeah. But Scott, Rouse, and Mazzccua all would have way higher grades than any Husker lineman has had, but by like 6, 7, 8 points in some cases. I mean, their run blocking grades are really good. I know it's not apples to apples, different conferences and all that. But point being, these are guys who have their tape has looked pretty good to people who are observing it. And there'd be a lot of optimism. And also, it's amazing how in 3 to 4 weeks, the entire narrative around Donovan Raiola is just sort of different, like it was like, what the stink, that was honestly what it was with a lot of fans and things. And now you're getting the quotes about how players are like, they had to bring that guy back, and even Walter Rouse was told by a player on his visit, he's like, that was the one guy they needed to bring back was Donovan Raiola. That's what Rouse was told. And it's just fascinating how that has done a 180 in a month. Obviously, they're going to have to prove it on the field, but having two or three new transfers sure would help the scenario for Raiola.
Yeah, I mean, if you have an entirely different left side of your offensive line that features Walter Rouse and Micah Mazuka, and then at center you have Ben Scott, like that's pretty amazing to me compared to what this looked like, at the end of the season, and then even just getting Ben Scott, who again I have as probably their number one addition from the portal so far, just being able to kind of build out that left side, and you could move Corcoran to right guard and Prohaska to right tackle, and that could be really, really interesting. And then you got a ton of depth behind it, which, if they bring in both of these guys, I think you're going to have some corresponding transfers out for Nebraska as well after the spring. But we can attack those as they happen. Let's take a small break. We'll come back. We're going to discuss Nebraska basketball, a big game on Tuesday night. Nebraska basketball, 8 p.m. tip against Illinois, an Illinois team that had a big win against Wisconsin over the weekend. They have sort of not really been in a free fall, but it is not it's not been a good year over in Champaign for basketball. There's apparently some chemistry concerns and locker room concerns, and Brad Underwood's unhappy, which, that's not a big surprise, but there's some issues there, and Nebraska would be catching them at a good time, but they got that win over against Wisconsin. Nebraska got an important win on the road against Minnesota. Illinois has been one of those teams that I feel like Nebraska plays close with most of the time, even when Illinois has had, a relatively significantly better roster. I go back to that pandemic year. I think Nebraska took them into overtime. That really awful last 15 seconds in which Teddy Allen and Trey McGowan's basically fought over how the final play should be run on the floor, and no shot actually got off. So that's kind of what I remember. And Nebraska, Illinois, I feel like it's been a good matchup for these teams in the past. What are you guys thinking tonight as Nebraska hosts Illinois at home? They played better at home this year. BC, where does your head go with this game?
I think it's a complete toss-up. I think the spread kind of indicates that too. Other people believe that. I believe it was 2.5 or 3 points. I'll have to take a closer look at that in a second. But I don't see any reason why Nebraska can't win this game or be in position to win it, with 4 to 5 minutes left. I fully expect it to be that kind of game where it's tight and it's going to come down to the last couple possessions. I do think there is a confidence boost as disappointing as the regulation finish was against Minnesota, where you give up the 3 with 4 seconds left, and then you have to go to OT. And at the moment you're thinking like, okay, that was that opportunity lost, momentum's on the other side. There is something I think to be said for a game like that, where you really got punched in the face in a moment like that. And they came back and executed really well in OT to get the win. And I just think they sort of that gave them a jolt. So they've actually played better this year. Hoiberg mentioned this the other day too, sort of coming off losses where they've responded better. So now that's the question: is can they be the group that you deal with success well? You have a couple good days of prep and you put it together again. So we'll see. And they need some guys. It's got to be a night where Wilcher hits some shots. I always throw him as a wild card. He's on the floor a lot, and he's a guy who's going to get some open looks, and he's got to bury like 3 or 4 of them. That's the difference between winning and losing in games like this.
It might be.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just say, going back to that Minnesota game, it might seem like kind of elementary, but I liked how Nebraska basically kind of got tunnel vision in overtime on offense. And it was like, we're going to Griesel, we're going to Walker, and that's what we're doing. Gary can come in and, grab a rebound and get a putback, which that's kind of his game. But I don't know, that overtime period to me, and I think you're right, BC, is so different than what we saw last year or the year before that, where they had a plan, they executed the plan, and played to their strengths. Like and that sounds so simple, but that's not something that they've done with any kind of regularity recently. So I don't know. I mean, to me, I think you're right. That's a win you can absolutely build on, just because you were able to win playing your style of basketball, and especially after kind of the emotions of having that three buried at the end to send it to overtime. I didn't mean to cut you off, Schaefer, but that stood out to me. It was like, okay, this is a team that actually knows who they are, knows what they need to do when they're doing it. Like, how about that?
Yeah, that tells me that they have the ability, when they get into these stupid scoring droughts that they seemingly have every game, all the time, that they have the ability to pull themselves out of it. Like, my fear whenever Nebraska goes into an overtime game is, are they even going to get 5 points? Because it's so hard sometimes for them to score. They need a certain way of things to go, that when they sort of dialed it in, like you said, and it's like, okay, Walker's eating their lunch down there. We got to keep feeding him, and Sam can get to the rim. They had a little two-man game, and they just sort of went with that. And I'd like to see that more when they get into these kind of scoring droughts, because I think what happens sometimes is they just end up chucking threes. Like, I like Keisei Tominaga. I think he's an incredible energy guy. When he's on, it's a lot of fun. He can light up the hoop, and he can get the building rocking. But when he's not on, you don't need that guy taking bad shots. So it's just this thing where I feel like they're continually sort of figuring out the dynamics of how they can attack, when they can best attack, how you get guys like Wilcher and Tominaga, how you get value out of that. Because Tominaga, more than Wilcher, is a little bit better of a defensive player, but you're not getting a ton on the other end. Neither is an outstanding athlete. So you need them to hit shots, like Brian said. But when they're not, can you funnel that offense into a way that we saw in overtime where they were effective? And I think if they can sort of do that, then we can kind of avoid. I mean, you're always going to have a 2 to 4 minute scoring drought every now and then. But it's when Nebraska has like an 8-minute one against Iowa. That's absurd. Like, you have to be able to get out of that. And I think that they're learning that through Sam and Derek, they have a two-man game that they can kind of put together. I mean, I am blown away by how good Derek Walker has been for Nebraska this year. I mean, I thought he would be fine. I sort of scoffed a couple years ago when people regarded him as this like missing link, and he's just been better than I've expected all the way along. But the jump he's made, I mean, he's as good of a big man as I think I've ever seen Nebraska have. Not ever, but at least in the last 15 years. I mean, like,
It's Marich graduated.
Sounds, yeah. I mean, Alex Marich was good. There's a part of me that feels like Walker is a little bit better in some ways. I mean, I think Marich is maybe a better defender, but like Walker's touch around the rim, his ability to set up like his post moves, he's really good. And you know what? He's 25 years old. Like, there's some of that is has to do with his age and his experience. But man, it is unique to see Nebraska with that good of a low post player.
No, nobody wants to deal with them. I mean, that's the thing you have to say. Like, every game, you can tell it's like, oh crap. I mean, he does get what he wants and is pretty efficient. And you almost take it for granted at times. Like in the first half against Michigan State, he missed a couple at the rim, which was unlike him. And it felt like there was a trickle down effect for Nebraska's offense off of that. But yeah, he's been special. We could look back on this if they pull this one off tonight. This 3 or 4 day stretch was monumental because Minnesota could have gone either way. We'll see what happens tonight, but they have to play at Purdue Friday. And when you looked at the schedule, they're 1-3 going into Minnesota in the league. So you had this fear like, oh, if they don't get that Minnesota game, which is gettable, what if this ends up being like 1-6 suddenly, and then we're all like, oh man, we're not really paying attention anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So they have a great opportunity here to really, over a 4-day span, I think sort of cement the idea like this Big Ten season is worth watching. Like, I think they did the first part of that, and now it's like put the period at the end of that sentence tonight. This would be the opportunity.
There's mobility in the Big Ten, right? Like they could be a middle of the pack Big Ten team, and I don't think that's out of the question. Sorry, Brooks.
I was gonna say, I think right now, Nebraska took Purdue to overtime, but I think it's, you've got Purdue at the top on one bookend, Minnesota at the other end, and I don't know that there's much settled in between there in terms of where teams kind of fall in the pecking order. Just if you look at the game-to-game results and, where teams are winning and it just feels like there's going to be much more of just kind of a car crash in the middle of the conference standings this year based on how everybody's playing right now. So I don't know. I mean, there's opportunity there, and Nebraska, I think, has shown that they can play tough and they can kind of get in the muck a little bit and win some of those games. So I think Brian's right where, it feels like tonight's setting up to be a really big one in terms of opportunity and maybe catching a team at a good time on a 8 p.m. Tuesday start.
Yeah, a guy mocked me on Twitter, and big deal, but there's others who I think would think like this because I called it a huge win when they beat Minnesota, and he's like, they're 0-4 in the league, and it was basically like you're making too big a deal about it. But that, to me, was there's a few of these games on the road where there's going to be opportunities where, you can put that in your pocket. And then if this is that, we've seen these Husker teams in certain years where they're pretty special at home, and that's what you're kind of hoping it shows itself tonight again. Did against Iowa, who, by the way, has kind of bounced back amid sort of messy situation there. But they've won a couple in a row and played better since the Nebraska loss. So that's looking like a better win now. It's one of those deals that Fred Hoiberg talked about a week or so ago. He believes this team can hold serve at home a lot of the time. And then it's those games like Minnesota where if you go get them, it gets pretty interesting as far as like postseason bids. We can get in all that if they earn that conversation in a few weeks. But Minnesota's the type of game you have to make that possible in February.
Yeah, it's a big win or a huge win, not because it's over Minnesota, but because you got to win on the road and you're able to kind of get back that loss to Purdue. I mean, they talking about holding serve at home, they have to get to the NIT, which I think is the upside of this team. They've got to win a bunch of home games. And you look at the month of January where they don't have as many. February is going to be a big home month, but they still have some important contests at home. And some of these teams, we used to think that Penn State and Northwestern, those were the sort of games that you had to kind of win to build up your resume a little bit. Like those are teams that are playing really well right now. Northwestern 12-3, Penn State's 11-5. Like those aren't going to be gimmies regardless of where they're at. And so I think any win on the road is a big one right now for Nebraska because I think they're a different team at home, and I think we're going to see that on Tuesday night. You guys want to make predictions?
Yeah.
Do we want a mini little hype cast in this? Should I ask you, Bruntz, who's your pick to click?
James Carney. That's my pick to click. No, I think it's got to be Derek Walker. I think if he can stay out of foul trouble and stay on the floor, I think he's got a chance to really kind of exploit things offensively. I think when he really gets going, he's kind of got that. I mean, he's old, like he's 25, but he's kind of got that old man game. I mean, he goes hard to his right, kind of flipping him up off the runners that bigger posts can't really deal with. So he's going to be my pick to click. I think you're going to see some driveway game from him, just backing the kid down and showing some nice touch around the rim.
I think it was Walker. He had a moment against Minnesota where he got the guy trapped so far under the rim that when he just jumped up, he sort of just like pushed it over the rim the way like an adult would to a little kid.
Yeah,
it was pretty funny to watch that thing play out. BC, who you got? Who's your pick to click?
Why
is it CJ Wilger?
No, Juwan Gary. Juwan Gary, he's the garbage man. He's a guy who's gonna do the dirty stuff for you. Had a really good game against Minnesota, especially with that putback at the end, which was kind of the difference. And this is a bully game. I mean, Illinois is going to try to make your lip bleed, and I think Nebraska feels like they've got a type of team that can kind of match that. I feel like it's going to be a game where Brad Underwood's like, I'm doing a lot of hand motions in this podcast, but Brad Underwood's going to, like get in the face of the official and people are going to tell him to sit down and stuff. I like this. I think there's going to be a little bit of a nastiness in the air tonight. Yeah. That's what I'm anticipating and hoping for. And that's a game that Juwan Gary, to me, that's why he's on this team, to live in those moments and help Nebraska.
I thought you were describing him there as an enforcer. So he's the Lat Mayan of this team, or Lat Mayhem, if you will. That was born out of an Illinois loss for Nebraska. I'm going to go with Sam Greisel. In these kinds of games, you got to protect the ball. He plays a lot of their kind of point guard role. Illinois definitely will ratchet up the pressure in terms of defense to try to force teams to turn it over, get easy baskets. So he's got to be careful with the ball, and he's still got to be your kind of your number two option. I mean, he's had a really nice season so far. He's been better than I anticipated, and this is going to be an important game for him, and they need him to be good with the ball. And also when he gets in those situations and he can use his size, back down some guards, get some easy baskets in the paint. So it's going to be important, I think, for him to have double digits tonight and to try to help Nebraska keep the turnovers down so Illinois can't run it out on them. All right. Any final thoughts here, gentlemen?
Give me Nebraska 70-67. That's my score.
70-67. I don't even know if Nebraska can touch a 70 right now.
That's what it's going to be, 70-67.
I'm predicting more manageable beer lines at Pinnacle Bank Arena tonight, although still a little bit, still kind of finding their footing a little bit, still early in the season.
Juwan Gary put back with 7 seconds left. Nebraska 57, Illinois 55. There's your oddly specific prediction and a score.
I like it.
All right. Bruntz, did you give a score?
I didn't. I'll go Nebraska. I'll say 67-65. I think you get. What are you laughing at? Was that what you said?
No. I just like that we all have like sort of a 2 to 3 point putback type. Yeah.
Did you guys lose any money on that meaningless 3-pointer, by the way?
No, but I know people that did, and they're not happy about it.
Yeah, that mattered to some. 67-65. I think Nebraska, against all odds, is able to salt it away at the free throw line and hangs on.
All right, there you have it. Anything you guys want to add? We might be back later this week with another podcast. Get back into doing 2 a week.
I think I've added all that I can.
Yeah,
I have nothing left.
I emptied the tank.
Yeah, I don't. I think that was a Homer podcast at the end, all picking Husker hoops. Yeah, we're on the Husker hoops bandwagon.
Yeah, that's obviously there's a lot of Kool-Aid being flown around. If
that Minnesota win just got us like a hop in our step.
Huge. All right. We'll be back with more Husker247 podcast content. Until then, be sure to check out Husker247.com. Plenty of content on there. Micah Mazuka, who we talked about earlier in this podcast, he announces on Tuesday night. So keep an eye out for that as well. We'll see when Walter Rouse makes his announcement. We'll see if Nebraska ends up with 1, 2, or none of these offensive linemen that they hosted over the weekend. For Michael Bruntz, Brian Christopherson, I'm Mike Schaefer. We'll catch you next time.